Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. With 2025 approaching, I thought one of the things we could do is have a look at a bunch of vehicles I would love to see in 2025. And also for you to give me your thoughts about what you would like to see this year when it comes to vehicles. I know we always talk about mechanics and, improvements to kind of customizations and even just general updates and what people would like to see. But this time, let's just focus on the core of the game. Which vehicles would you like to see? Because at the end of the day, when it comes to War Thunder, there's a ton of vehicles already in the game, but there's also a ton that is still sat on the sidelines. And as usual, it would be great to see them all, but of course people have favorites. So in this video, that's what I'm going to go through, some of the ones I want to see this year for various different reasons. As always, if you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe. Let's get started. One of the vehicles I would love to see now is the MiG-25. The F-117 has been added, and it is basically a meme vehicle. It's one of those which is a bit of eye candy, a bit of fun to look at, but generally completely worthless. So now, it's time to add the MiG-25 at a BR where it's going to be intercepted, and also to kind of be worthless at the end of the day. The MiG-25 is one of those vehicles that doesn't fit in War Thunder, but since we're in the period of War Thunder, we're adding vehicles that don't fit, like the F-117, why not just go a bit crazy and add this one too? Luckily with the MiG-25, there's a bunch of different variants that all really don't fit in the game, so therefore you could just add all of them in a fun way, and just kind of go from there. So what is the MiG-25? Imagine a vehicle with just massive engines. Absolutely huge honkers, which basically makes the vehicle nearly go Mach 3. And it goes incredibly fast in a straight line and doesn't really do anything else. The vehicle itself really has some terrible G limits for turning, so it can't really turn. It would actually take the vehicle some size of maps in War Thunder to turn it, which I think would be quite interesting, and also its armament is quite limited too. You either have the R-40s, which are these large missiles, which we haven't actually got added to the game yet. I see them as very similar to stuff like the earlier missiles from other nations, where they're just huge, massive ones, which are designed to kind of intercept bombers, which is why they're not really that useful. And then also it can carry some R-60s, which of course would be much more short range. So technically this vehicle, at least in the later variants, could have some funny armament. It also doesn't have access to a gun, because of course you're never going to be using a gun at that speed, and it's just another example of a crazy interceptor, which was feared for a long time when it came to the world, and actually created the dominance that we see in American aviation nowadays, which I know sounds a little bit weird, but the Americans were so afraid of this thing because they couldn't really work out, how the Soviets were doing it, how they were breaking all of these records, how they were going insanely fast. So then America started working on new projects, including stuff like the F-15, which dominated the world. And since then, America hasn't really looked back. And then when the Americans ended up getting access to a MiG-25, they realized they had a lot of problems with it, such as engine maintenance, meaning that the amount of flight hours a specific model could have was incredibly low. The materials that it used as well basically limited it heavily, and of course, the simple fact that the vehicle didn't carry a lot of armament. But, as I said, in War Thunder nowadays, that doesn't matter, because we get some weird and wonky vehicles, so let's get it in. The next vehicle is a set of vehicles, and it's World War II SPHs. For me, when we have a look at SPHs in War Thunder, a big focus has been on more modern systems. Recently we got the Panzer stuff like the PLZ-05, but also we got stuff like the M109s, right? And then a lot of other vehicles, such as the Type 75 SPH, and many others which are from that kind of 1950s to modern era. Now, the thing is, World War II had a bunch of SPHs as well, whether you look at German ones, whether you look at American ones, whether you look at Canadian ones, or even British ones, or even many others. And some nations have some in the game, such as the Soviets with their kind of like SPG assault gun ideas, with stuff like the ISU-152, the SU-122, the SU-100, these types of things, and also things like the Stug IIIs for the Germans. So, of course, what would be nice to see is the more kind of, I suppose, top-down ideas, stuff like the Vesper, stuff like the Hummel, the things such as the Bishop, the Sexton, the Priest, all of these types of vehicles would be great to see in the game. There's also a bunch of other ones which use stuff like 105s or, you know, some larger caliber stuff too, and it just would be cool to see these things. I mean, why not at the end of the day? A lot of vehicles were kind of set up in this way, whether even if you want to add in stuff like the Deacon to this, which is basically just a truck with a gun mounted on the back. These types of vehicles I feel like would be quite limited in War Thunder, but if we have stuff like the M44 in the game, which is kind of similar in the way that it's set up, why not add these things and have a bit of fun? I think it's also time for the most successfully unsuccessful tank that was ever built, the Covenantor. The Covenantor is one of the first cruiser tanks that was built by the British. They made nearly 2,000 of them. They basically built just over 1,500 or 1,700 of them, and they never fought in a single battle. How crazy is that? Having nearly 2,000 vehicles, and they were never used in active combat. These vehicles have the 2-pounder gun, they have some Bessas, and also they have a pretty good power to weight because they use the Meadows engine with 340 horsepower. The Covenantor, though, had a few issues. First of all, because it wasn't thick enough for the engine and also radiator combo, the radiator for the engine is on the front of the machine instead of on the back, which led to a few issues with certain pipes going alongside where the crew area was. But the interesting thing about it is the Covenantor is one of those vehicles that was really good for its time, but just never really got anywhere because it was outdated before it got to the front lines. So this vehicle was in service from 1940 to 1943. It used the 2-pounder gun, which was fantastic against stuff like the early Panzers. Things like the early Panzer 3s and 4s, they had the short-barreled 50mm, or they had the short-barreled 75s. The 2-pounder gun could outrange these things, and it meant that it was very, very impressive. So on the Covenantor, these guns were fantastic, but it became in service basically as the Battle of France was ending, and therefore none of them were shipped to France to be able to fight the Germans as they were blitzkrieging across the continent. And once the North African campaign started, which was the next kind of major campaign that the British were involved in, obviously you had the Battle of Britain as well, but the ground portion being the North African campaign, the Covenantor was outdated. So they'd built a bunch of them, but they weren't very useful, and this is because the Germans ended up developing the long-barreled 50mm that could outrange the Covenantor. They also started adding extra metal plates to their vehicles in the form of spaced armor, so therefore the Covenantor was worthless compared to them. The Panzers could outrange them, and also they could outgun them. So it became kind of a vehicle that was stuck in time, and this meant that they couldn't really use it in active deployment because it would have just got shredded. So instead, they actually brought it back and used it for training purposes instead. So that's where its kind of role was. But because of its unique design, with its engine and its radiator, because of the fact that it is one of the first British cruiser tanks, it would be great to see this actually in the game. It is one of those vehicles that would fit in War Thunder because, of course, it doesn't have to fight what it was going to in real life. And also there was a few different variants of it which they could also add, which were more SPH variants that we talked about before, such as the Covenantor Mark II CS, which was one which had access to a 3-inch howitzer. So you don't have to just go for the 2-pounder one, you could go for a different one too. It's also once again time to talk about the Monitor class of warships. Basically, small machines with big old donkey guns on it, which were designed for being able to take out like coastal stuff, or at least create some coastal bombardments. Just imagine you take just a small boat and you just add a turret from a battleship. That's basically what we're talking about. For example, you had the HMS Marshal Ney, for example, which was commissioned into service in 1915. So this was a First World War monitor. And this had a twin-mounted 15-inch set of guns. It also had some 3-inch guns on it and 40mm as well, which was changed over time. But this thing is basically just a little floating barge which has a massive set of guns. And I think it would just be kind of fun just to have. I don't know how you would balance them, but hey, the F-117 exists, so we're in that type of era. This vehicle itself only went 11 kilometers an hour, or 6 knots, so it's not going to get anywhere anytime soon, but also it would be able to donk a few people, which was quite nice. The cool thing about these vehicles as well is they actually do have quite a lot of armor on them, because obviously they weren't very fast and not very big. They could kind of bulk them up, especially since they were designed specifically for one type of play. So yeah, let's get some monitors in, let's have a bit of fun. In 2025, I also think it's time to continue the dreams come true idea with a World War II vehicle that many have been looking forward to for the longest time, the Stug IV. We've had pretty much everything else added from the 10 years ago kind of tech trees that Gaijin had foreground. Not everything, but most things have turned up in specific ways. Some things have been modified, others have been adapted. But the Stug IV is one of those vehicles that still hasn't made it, and it might be the longest lasting vehicle on those kind of old tech trees that were proposed to get added, apart from the aviation ones actually, because the aviation ones were kind of nuts. We'll have a look at them in the new year. But basically, the Stug IV is the longest lasting ground vehicle that hasn't turned up yet. Now, the Stug IV is pretty simple. Imagine a Stug III, but on a Panzer IV chassis. That's pretty much it. You know, the simple fact is they saw how effective the SPGs were, the Stug III specifically, and were like, hey, we should build stuff off the Stug IV chassis, since we have a lot of Stug IV chassis sat around, and it's cheaper to build these SPGs than it is the actual Panzers themselves. So, there you go. Easy peasy. Nothing too crazy about it. They made a bunch of them during the war, and for some reason, they've just never made it into War Thunder, even though they've been mentioned many times, and a lot of other vehicles that were in a similar position to them have been added. Stuff like the B-26, for example, things like the KV-7 from this year, and even the Elephant, which was a Battle Pass vehicle. So, let's get the Stug IV in game, let's get it rocking. The last vehicle I would love to see is another British invention that definitely left its mark in history, at least for a few months. The Bolton Defiant. The Defiant is a bit of a weird vehicle. A lot of people think it's a Hurricane, but it isn't. It's its own kind of unique design that they ended up building, and basically what it is a interceptor aircraft which is designed around a slightly different idea. Instead of having the offensive armaments going in the forward direction, the offensive armament went in the backwards direction. This vehicle was actually powered by a Merlin 3 piston engine, which gave it quite a lot of horsepower, but the issue with it wasn't exactly a light vehicle. So the maximum speed that this thing could go, especially with its poor aerodynamics compared to other aircraft, was only 489 kilometers an hour. Now, the key thing about the Defiant, since it was an interceptor, it actually had a turret on it, and this had a set of quad 303 Browning machine guns. So, you would have your pilot in the front, you'd have the gunner in the back, and the idea is you would actually go in front of the aircraft, and generally lower than them, and then rat-a-tat-a-tat with the 303s, and then leave. This actually made the Defiant have quite a nice record for, once again, a few months of the war, because the Germans had no idea what was hitting them. They couldn't understand why this fighter aircraft was actually shooting behind and taking them out. Since they figured it out, though, they realized the plane wasn't really quick enough and also wasn't very maneuverable enough to be able to deal with them. So once they changed their tactics against it, once they realized what they were fighting, it wasn't great. So it ended up getting hammered in the early areas of the war. Now, what they eventually did is they changed it to night fighter duty and made it intercept bombers. But it ran into another problem. It just wasn't fast enough. It just didn't go quick enough, which is why they increased the engine power on it and added also an aircraft interception radar in the Mark II. So that one we could definitely see, or we could see the Mark I variant. It would be really cool to see either, just because it's something we haven't really had in the game before. You have stuff like the P-61, but that still has a forward offensive armament, and the Defiant doesn't, so it would just be kind of cool. As always though, if you have any suggestions or things you would like to see, please let me know, and look after yourselves. I really hope you have a great new year. See you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.